Thank you very much for a very warm welcome. It's my privilege to give this presentation. The one thing is the clicker from there, or is there a clicker here? You from there? Okay. So as the was introduced the topic, I'm going to talk about mathematical model of a stored grain ecosystem as a management tool. And then give you some overview of why mathematical modeling is needed and what mathematical modeling is and how it can help preserve the grains which are produced and lost a significant amount all over the world. If you are not from that area, you may not appreciate globally about third of the food is lost every year. Third of the produced food. So if you do the estimation or calculation, and that can feed probably close to, I would say, 3 or 4 billion people can be fed from that lost food. So we need to preserve what has been produced. Another thing to keep in mind is when we produce food, we spend a lot of energy, we spend a lot of resources like fertilizer, water, which is in a scarce supply, and land mass. How we grew the food production was we did a lot of deforestation and brought a lot of land into cultivation, but we can't do any more deforestation. There is not much left, and whatever is left, if we deforest that, we would have a disaster on the climate change side. So those are many issues why we want to preserve what has been produced. Next. So first I want to start by acknowledging what I'm going to summarize today is the research done over past 30 years by many of my graduate students, both masters and doctoral students, and also postdoctoral fellows or research associates. So in general term, I use research trainees over past 30 years. Their work has been a tremendous contribution to my research program. So I certainly thank them for their contribution. And any research program cannot be successful if we don't have the funding to do that research. As Dr. Sanmugam was saying, the students' stipends have to be paid, postdoctoral fellowships have to be paid. So you have to bring in the research funding to be able to support them. And that research funding came from many organizations. But in particular, I would mention is the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. I think in India that we equivalent to DST, Department of Science and Technology, who funds research in all of the natural science and engineering. But I had funding from many other sources like provincial government, many industry partners, industry funded projects. So I certainly thank those research organizations. So what are the mathematical models? The mathematical models are mathematical representation of any biological, physical, or chemical process. Typically, these mathematical models are represented by using either differential equations, but in most cases, partial differential equations. Being students from all or staff from engineering, you would know the importance and significance of the partial differential equations. And to solve these partial differential equations, you need to have appropriate boundary conditions. You need to understand what's happening at the boundary. And you also need to understand what's happening at the beginning of the system. So that's the initial conditions. And once you have formulated your partial differential equations with appropriate boundary and initial conditions, and then you solve those equations, you then get the result, which would be predictive of the conditions within the grain mass or within the domain of the mathematical model. Next. So you would see there are many systems where mathematical models have been used to advance the field and then do the research in those areas. Some of the examples I start again being from engineering group, you would understand simply supported beam is the first thing you take in a statics class or statistics and dynamics class. And you try to predict what would be the deflection in that. And as you know, the deflection would be dependent on the width, would be dependent on the depth of the beam, would depend on the material of the beam, because that determines the physical property of that. It also would be dependent on the load you are applying. So there are many factors. You study those. Although in the first year, when you are taking a statistics class, you are not given what happens if questions. A lot of what happens if questions would arise in designing the simply supported beam. And to do that, if you have to do calculations by hand, it would take a lot of time. So if you had a mathematical model, you could ask a lot of questions. What would happen if I changed the material to wood? What would happen if I was designing this from the steel or concrete or copper? How deep a beam I would need? How wide a beam should be? And a lot of those questions could be answered by that mathematical model. That would be an example of the model which you would have used, and hopefully the professor who was teaching that class would have used a mathematical model to give you an opportunity to ask what happens if questions. There are mathematical models for bioreactors, and those mathematical models are used for predicting what would happen when you change the parameters of the processing of a biomaterial. And then when you change the parameter, what would be the effect on the yield? So to be able to predict the yield of from the bioreactors. Individual cells, there are mathematical models which are used for understanding how the material or energy flows across the cell boundary. And those models then are used when you introduce an infection, for example, a viral infection, what changes occur into the cell. Or if you're developing a new drug and you expose that cellular material to the drug, what interactions or what changes are occurring in the cell. So you study that using the mathematical models of the cells. There are mathematical models of the plant growth where you take the soil conditions into consideration, the environmental conditions into consideration, and predict what would be the yield, biomass production, and then also predict what would be the yield at the end of the complete cycle. There are forest mathematical models for forestry ecosystem, which are used for predicting the growth in the forest. You plan the cutting programs, the fire management program, and mathematical models are used for managing large forest ecosystems. Climate change, which we are all familiar, is a reality now. But initial predictions of that climate change is occurring were done using mathematical models because we were not measuring, we were not able to measure global temperatures, we were not able to measure changes in the global ecosystem, and initial predictions were done using mathematical models. And even today, the climate change models are very significant, which are refined. As the new data become available, they get refined, and then their prediction accuracies continue to improve. So they are used. Our team has focused mainly on developing stored grain ecosystem models, and that's what I would talk to you as an example, that how mathematical models can be used for managing stored grain. Next. So to understand a phenomena, what was done, and some of you probably would have heard some of these terms. So typically what used to be that if you were designing a large system, you would develop a model system. And you would then do a lot of experiment on the model and then try to understand how model is behaving. And then hopefully from understanding the behavior of the model, you would try to predict what would happen in the field. And that was the reason why, because that translation was not very smooth and easy, a term was factor of safety was used. Because you don't know what would happen in the field because you are only studying a small model. And early days, engineers used a factor of safety as high as 3. So whatever you calculate based on the model, you would multiply those values by 3 to make sure that the structure or system doesn't fail. With time, with the understanding, improved understanding, the factor of safety nowadays is around 1.5. So that the impact of that understanding is significant because the material cost get reduced in building the systems, and that has a large economic saving. Possibly, by doing these model studies, they were trying to predict what would happen for the larger system. And that's why it was referred to as a trial and error. And even today, there are systems when we don't understand them well, we use trial and error. And the trial and error still is a engineering method which is used. But you still need a lot more experiments to then adjust the parameters so that you can predict what will happen on the larger system. repeat similar process for different size and types of larger system. So rather than just making a one model, you might make 2 or 3 model of different sizes, and the dimensional analysis would be done using different sizes, and then from that dimensional analysis, you may try to predict the behavior of the larger systems. But it was not easy to generalize when you were doing these small model studies, to generalize that you could predict for everything what's happening in the larger system. So this is what was the process commonly used, and is still used to some extent when you don't know about the system. But when you deal with the biological systems, it adds another complexity, and that is the inherent biological variability. The physical systems, like when you look at the properties of the steel, for example, are fixed. Like, you know, the modular velocity doesn't change. You can calculate the areas and the length and width very easily. When you're dealing with the biological system, like if you took 100 kernels of wheat, they all would be very different sizes, different shape might be very similar, but because of the size differences, their interaction with other grains would change, the thermal properties would change, physical properties would change. So it makes the modeling biological system even a lot more complex than the physical systems. Next. So a stored grain ecosystem as an example. So when I say grain, I always include in that cereal grains like wheat, rice, corn, or paddy, which would be unpolished rice. Oil seeds like canola or soya beans would be example of oil seed, and pulses. So mung bean, urad, or chickpeas, lentils would fall in that. All of these materials have one thing in common. When they are in dry conditions, they flow freely, and they are granular in structure, or in terms of the granularity. When you fill them in the storage structure, all of them would exert a pressure on the wall system, whereas the water, for example, does not exert the pressure on the friction force vertical downward on the system. But all fluids, including water or liquids, would exert the stress along the circumference of the structure, but they also apply the physical force or friction along the walls. So that's what the grains are referred to as. Grains are stored from the farmer to the consumer at many points. Sometimes it's stored on the farm, sometimes it's stored at the collection points, and then processing facilities would store, retailers would store, so it's stored at many points. Also, the bins where the materials are stored are made of many materials. It could be wood, concrete, steel, for example, plastic even. They may be, some bins are equipped with drying and aeration systems. Each grain type has its own physical, thermal, and hygroscopic properties. They all produce different amount of heat, moisture, and the gases when they spoil. So each grain has its own properties. Each grain may include different amount of dockage and foreign material, and these are the material which should not be present in the grain. And when you fill them in the structure, they distribute non-uniformly inside the storage structure. So that variability in the physical parameters or the material itself also causes the variability in the properties of the materials. Next. Grain can be infested by different types of insects, and that again, I don't know in ag engineering program here. So, and then the survival and growth of the growth is affected by the grain temperature, moisture content, and the gas concentrations. And the gas concentration here is really referring to is the carbon dioxide. So when grain is spoiled, it produces carbon dioxide. And then if the carbon dioxide builds up too much, then it would have impact or effect on its growth cycle of the insects and the mold. Insect develop and move in grain bulk. And then the local weather certainly has interaction with the storage structure, because depending on the outside conditions, the inside of the grain could be heated. It can pick up the moisture being a hygroscopic material. So all of that factor into account. So if you take all these last two slides, basically talked about the different factors which can affect the stored grain ecosystem. if you have to design experimental studies to understand that phenomena, it would become cost prohibitive. Or I would say it's basically is impossible, because you will not be able to conduct all different type of experiments required to design battery storage systems. So that's the reason why mathematical models then can play a role and help manage the stored grain. So next. So why we need to preserve grains? Some of that I said at the beginning, so I won't repeat. Certainly the world population is growing. We need to produce more food to feed the people. I already talked about the effect of the climate change and the other thing which you need to take into consideration is, like, globally, what has happened over time is that to feed the growing world population, the emphasis has been placed on producing more food. Develop the varieties which can yield more, but no attention was paid to preserve what has been produced. That if you don't have to, if you can preserve, whether it's a 20% loss or 30% loss or 10% loss, you don't have to produce that much more, because that would increase the food availability. So very little attention was paid. And if you do the cost estimate or economic analysis, preserving grain is less expensive than producing more when you take all of the inputs and the environmental factors into consideration. And mathematical models therefore have tremendous potential to increase the availability of grains to feed the growing world population. Next. So looking at the stored grain ecosystem, the best way I think I can describe that is if there was nothing happening, you take the grain and put that in a system. Like a system could be your grain, a bag of grain, could be a silo, metal silo, could be a concrete silo of any size. So when you put in there what interactions are happening and what need to be mathematically modeled. So geographical location would decide, basically would dictate what are the parameters there in the yellow. So wind velocity would affect, and you would know the convective heat transfer coefficient is affected by the wind, for example. Air humidity and temperature would affect the interaction with the grain because of the hygroscopic nature. Solar radiation would impact the structure, which then would have an impact on the stored grain. Atmospheric pressure comes into play, is because if there is a sudden drop in the pressure, then to equilibrate, air has to move out of the structure. So there would be an air exchange between the surrounding and the grain. So that's how the atmospheric pressure comes into play. And structure I already mentioned of the material, but also the shape of the structure would have an effect, whether it's a circular bin, cylindrical bin, or rectangular or square bin, that would have impact. What's in the green are the transfer mechanism which are happening in the stored grain ecosystem. So there's a heat transfer, moisture transfer, gas transfer, and insect movement. The one thing about, I think about 10 years ago or maybe 12 years ago, we were doing experiments and trying to understand how to model movement of insect inside the grain bin. And when we were doing experiments, very fortunate for us, insects behave like gas molecules. So they diffuse randomly in the grain. And because they diffuse randomly, you can solve them using the fixed law of diffusion, or the mathematical model for the diffusion equation can be applied to insect. What is needed in that case is how do you calculate the diffusion coefficient? And the diffusion coefficient calculation requires then a lot of experimentation because you have to then understand there's a, like if there was a uniform condition, insect would behave differently than if you have a heat in one area, like could be solar radiation. If the grain warms up, do insect move there? If it is a high moisture somewhere, do they move there? So a lot of experiments required. And I think 5 or 6 different PhD students have completed their PhD just on understanding movement of insect. And the end result of that is to calculate the diffusion coefficient, which is then used in the partial differential equation to solve. So those are the 4 different phenomena. And those 4 different phenomena, then when you solve those equations, the end result is what's in the purple there, is that it would give you a gas concentration, temperature, moisture content, and insect number at any location inside your domain, whether it could be a bag or bin, any location. And using that information, then you can make the decisions on where to sample the bin, where to install the sensors for monitoring the bin. And once you have those predicted values of temperature, moisture, gas, and insect number, they then have effect on insect population itself. If a higher temperature, again in the storage condition range, higher the temperature, usually there's a higher multiplication of insects, for example. They also produce more heat. They produce more moisture. So that provides the what you see with the blue lines there is the feedback to the transfer models, and that is the heat generation or capital Q term in your heat transfer equations, the heat generation or sink term, which is a part of those partial differential equations. So that's what that provides. So this interaction happens, and then so if you solve this model for 3 hours, let's say, for time interval, then at the next 3 hours, the conditions have changed. So you would have to do the iterative solution of these equations. Next. So that's what the system can be used then. So there's a one way, like if you had instrumented every bin, which can monitor these parameters, then you don't need mathematical models. But as I said earlier, you cannot instrument bins, all the bins. It's practically impossible. Okay, and bins are distributed all over the world. If you look at the global phenomena, they are located from a farmer's house to a field outside at the port, and the large structure, a smaller structure. But if the bins are instrumented, then they could have sensors for gases. When grains is spoiled, they produce off odor, which I'm sure if you have smelled any time a spoiled grain, you would know right away that how bad the odor is. The temperature, humidity sensors, and insect counters can be installed in the bins, and then you know where the insects are distributed. Once you have the bin like that instrumented, then you could make the decisions on automatically starting the aeration system to cool the grain, for example, or you could start a fumigation system to control the insects if the insect population is growing. The data can be transferred remotely to a central location, but they could also be communicated to the manager or farmer, and farmer could be anywhere from near the bins versus in this example I'm showing they're lying on the beach somewhere, and they still can receive the information what's happening to their grain in the bin. Next. I already mentioned the sensors in the previous slide, so we can go to the next. Also the Internet of Things, which, as you know, by definition is many smart sensors or many smart things are communicating with each other through the data communication network. So that's where the term Internet of Things comes from, the interconnection of the many things, and that's where the connection of the different sensors. But not sensors just in one bin, but you could have bins distributed around the globe, and you still can collect the data from those bins and make the decisions on those bins located anywhere in the world. Data can be collected and processed from multiple bins equipped with sensor at a single location using the Internet of Things. And management decisions then can be made for an individual bin if bins are instrumented. But as I said, all bins cannot be instrumented and are not instrumented. That's where, because these are not instrumented, you cannot make those decisions without instrumentation. And many bins are located in the remote areas where there is not enough data transmission capability. So again, you could not make the decisions. And that's where the mathematical models can play. I think next slide shows the some example of the bin, the different type of sensors you would see in the bin. In this case, it can monitor the drying front going through the grain mass. It can also monitor the moisture and humidity condition. Insector, there's an insector there which monitors the number of insects in the area. So if you want to know the insect distributed throughout the bin, you would need many insectors, for example. Next. This is an example of cloud-based monitoring and control. So the bin is located, what you see there is in Australia, and it's being monitored from Canada. And the decisions to turn on the aeration system or control the grain is being made from office in Calgary. And and this could be done for a bin anywhere in the world, like and then you can control the management of the grain from single location. I will mention why it is important. Is like, so when we developing partial differential equations, and solving 4 partial differential equations simultaneously, you need very powerful computing capability. Every farmer, you cannot expect to have a powerful computer to run the mathematical model. But you could have model running in one place in the cloud, or nowadays cloud is the term used, but at a single place. Farmer can upload their bin information. Model can run even on a supercomputer and then send the result back to the farmer for that particular bin. So you can run for multiple bins, you can run for individual bin. So that's why this data monitoring and data control, remote control of the data become very important, because once you get the result from the mathematical model, you should be able to then make the decisions on what to do next with the grain. Next. So stored grain ecosystem models, by now you would appreciate it requires solution of 4 partial differential equations simultaneously: heat, moisture, gas transfer, and insect movement. Can be modeled using partial differential equations. It need to be able to handle, and again, very easy to do, is the internal generation of the heat, moisture, and the gases, and the odors, for example. We need to understand the insect population dynamics and the mortality as insects grow and multiply at different temperatures at different rates and different moisture contents. So we need to have that information. And insect movement is affected by the gradients of heat, moisture, and gas concentration. And that need to be built in into our diffusion coefficient and the bias velocity of the insects. So these are the coefficient and the partial differential equations. Usually you have a D for the diffusion coefficient and typically V for the velocity term. So here the velocity would be the insect movement velocity, basically. Next. So the solution of the stored grain ecosystem model requires understanding of, once you have developed the partial differential equation, then you need to understand the boundary and initial conditions for all 4 different models. Value of the physical and thermal properties of grains, and that's where a lot of work come from agriculture engineering. Like, so a lot of theses are done on measuring the specific heat, thermal conductivity of the different types of grains. So that's the area where, if you look at the ag engineering journals, any ag engineering journal, you would find 1 or 2 papers on physical properties measurement, drying coefficients, drying characteristic of the grains, coefficient of insect movement. There is not much work done. I think our group is the only one who is trying to develop those coefficients for insect movement. But again, the field is so open. We are only working with 2 insects. And in the world, there are about 600 insects. And we need to understand the diffusion coefficient for all different insects if we want to manage stored grain globally using the mathematical models. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. We need to know different grain, the heat generation, heat, moisture, and gas generation rates of different grains. And again, depending on number of grains you are dealing with, we are only working with wheat and canola, for example. And there are so many different type of grains where we need to understand what is their internal generation. So that's another area where ag engineers can play a huge role, and a lot of experimental work is needed. We need to understand the natural convection patterns. So when grain, if you don't do any forced ventilation, there are natural movement of the air inside the grain, and that does affect the moisture distribution. So we need to understand how that is occurring in different size bins, and it does get changed with the size of the bin. And we need to understand the population and dynamics of insect. Now, the reason I'm saying there is the lot of work is needed here, and it's not, that's the kind of work what typically would be done by entomologists. And we work very closely with the entomologists in our lab. So our team is interdisciplinary in that sense. And a lot of papers which are coming from the entomologist, because we work as a part of the team. So we are co-authors, and a lot of time people, they would meet me at a meeting and would think I'm an entomologist, but I say, no, I'm not an entomologist, but I work very closely with entomologists. So that's how integrated your team has to be, that you are contributing to understanding. The population dynamics, most of the entomologists, because they were not looking at it from a practical perspective, they were measuring the population dynamics under ideal conditions, because their goal was to predict how large the population can become. But in a stored grain, insects are never under ideal conditions, or they may be under ideal conditions for maybe an hour or maybe a few days. But most of the times they are either at a lower temperature or a higher temperature than their ideal condition or optimal condition. Same thing, they're at a different moisture content. And what is the population growth under those suboptimal conditions has to be incorporated in the mathematical model if you are trying to predict what would be the insect population in a month time or 3 months time and how they would distribute inside the bin. So a lot of work needed on the understanding that. And also grain may be warming up at some time, it may be cooling at other times, and how does the population dynamics is affected by that. Those changing conditions need to understand. So a lot of experimental work still need to be done in that area. And naturally, to do solve the mathematical model, you will require the local historical real-time data. Historical because you would use the historical data to do the validation and assessment and calculate the probability distributions of the results. And real-time and forecasted weather data are needed to make the decision what you need to do next 3 days. Like if it is going to be high humidity, should you allow the grain to be stored for the next 3 days? Or should you be selling it right now? Or should you be doing drying before you start storing? So you need the forecasted weather data for a week or 2 weeks to predict what's going to happen in the immediate future and what decision need to be taken in the immediate future. And historical data needed for the validation and development of the model. Solutions, how these partial differential equations are solved. Again, I'm sure if you are in graduate program in ag engineering, you would have taken mathematics courses and you would have used analytical method, finite difference, finite element, boundary element method, discrete element method, and any of these methods could be used. Typically, the most common solution technique is the finite element model, and the reason being it can handle the irregular boundaries and as well as the variable properties of the material at any location in the bin or in the domain. So finite element method is quite commonly used. You can solve these mathematical model for 1, 2, or 3 dimensions, but stored grain ecosystem is really a 3-dimensional system. So 1 and 2-dimensional models give you an approximation, but to match the real conditions, you have to solve the model in 3 dimensions. So it requires 3-dimensional conditions. Next. You can also have aeration or natural air drying models, and these models are predicting what's happening when you're ventilating the grain and what's happening to the moisture and temperature during that ventilation conditions. And many different, again, you would have taken these as part of your courses. You can have a non-equilibrium, again, partial differential equation-based model. You can have equilibrium or near equilibrium model, logarithmic models. And these models would predict then the grain temperature and moisture, which then can be integrated with your other model, which predicts temperature, moisture, gas concentration, and insect numbers. Next. So once you have those 2 mathematical models working together, that we can call it as a combined model or two model 1 and model 2, but combined model. So how it would work in making the decision. So for each bin, physical dimensions, like what size it is, what material it is, you only need to input that once in the database. And the GPS location, and the GPS location is needed so the weather data can be used for that location when we are doing the mathematical model prediction. And they are inputted at any time and then stored in the database. That doesn't have to be done every year, only once need to be done for the bin. During the harvest and filling, the bin grain type, like what are you filling in that bin? Once you know the physical condition, you need to tell what grain you are storing, because all of the thermal properties of the grain have to come into play in the mathematical model. So you would say, I'm filling wheat in this, or it's filling paddy in this bin. And so that kind of information. If you know the initial moisture content, you need to input that information. And most farmers know what the initial moisture content is when they are harvesting the grain. So that number need to be put. Temperature, many may not know what the temperature is, but the mathematical model, again, based on experimental data, if you are harvesting grain on a sunny day, it's about 10 degrees centigrade. Grain temperature is 10 degrees centigrade higher than the ambient temperature. So you can use the again, mathematical model can take that information. Once you put the date of harvest, it can calculate what the initial temperature of the grain would be. And then it can be even layer by layer. So you harvested 1 truckload came in the morning, can calculate what the initial temperature would be, and one came in around noon time, it can calculate what the number would be. So it can calculate that initial temperature. If bin has an aeration system, you need to provide that information. That it has a fan is like fan is available to be turned on or not, because that is then used for doing the mathematical modeling during aeration time, especially if the system decides there's time to do the aeration, then fan has to be turned on and the conditions has to be adjusted based on that model. And then you run the model basically based on the weather data from the real time or forecasted weather data. Next. When fan is off, then the stored grain ecosystem model would run for each bin and provide the final output with the final output after aeration as the initial conditions for the SGE model. Insect number can either be known, farmer might know that, but and if they don't know, you can start with the assumption of one adult, one female, one male, one female insect in the bin. Because with time, like I think whether you had one adult male and female or 6 adult male and female, the end result probably would not be that much different, because the population would start growing, and once it reaches certain stage, then the cannibalism happen and the crowding happen, insects start distributing. But if you know the initial number is good thing, because then it would do a lot more prediction. But if you don't know the initial number and you start basic assumption of one male, one female, then the initial part of the prediction of insect number would be with error. Basically, it would take maybe about 28 days or a month to adjust that number. Okay, because after a month they probably would be 500 pairs anyway. So 1 month it would be in error. After that, it would not make a difference. And then the stored grain model is run using real-time and forecast weather data when fan is off. So you either run the aeration model or run the SG model, and then both are then interconnected and predict the conditions of the grain throughout the storage period. Next. So what the mathematical models then can be used for is to predict the temperature, moisture, gas concentration, and insect number at each location within a bin and for many bins. Using that information, then I will come to the other side where you can make the decision. Mathematical model for each bin can be run in the cloud, so every farmer or storage manager does not have to have a high speed computer or supercomputer. Only need one supercomputer, for example, so that you can run the model very quickly and get the result back. Nowadays, nobody wants to wait on computer to have the indication that it's working. 1 or 2 minute people get start becoming impatient, so model has to run very fast. That's why I'm saying supercomputer. And knowing these values, you can make the decisions about individual bins. And the kind of decisions you can make, aeration could be turned on, for example, if the grain is not uniformly at uniform temperature. Grain turning could be recommended. What that means is if there is too much differences in the grain temperatures, by taking the grain out of one bin and putting in another bin equilibrates the temperature. So that's why turning is used. It could say it's time to turn, and then if you have an automated system, it can do it for you, or as a farmer, it gives you that information that you need to turn on the grain, do the grain turning. Drying could be recommended if the too much moisture is there and mold growth is happening. Fumigation could be recommended using CO2 or chemicals. The bin I showed you as an example bin, CO2 cylinder was already there to do the fumigation for controlling insects and reducing the insect population. Next. So in the model-based grain management, mathematical model storage system can enable the farmers and grain managers to make informed decisions about the grain management. And if bins have wireless grain monitoring and automated aeration systems, then drying control, these could be turned on automatically. And the data collected from these instrumented bins could be used to improve the mathematical models. Because you are always comparing, is a model predicting what I'm measuring? And if there are differences, then you need to either go back and look at your assumptions. Maybe the right assumptions were not made in the development of the mathematical model, or you need to look at is the right parameters are not being used. So that's where experimental work needs to be done to make sure that the right physical and thermal properties are being used. As an example, the database might have a properties of wheat, and you, for example, fill barley in the bin, and in the absence of any data for barley, default might be, let's use the wheat data, but the wheat data is not the right data, for example. But once you have measured the proper parameter for all grains, then it will pick the right parameters. Next. So in summary, basically, then the properly developed and validated mathematical models can be used to make decisions to manage grains. There is a need to enhance teaching in engineering and other program of tools to develop and solve mathematical models. I know a lot of time students get scared of the mathematical courses, but to me, as the one or two slide at the beginning I showed you, the mathematical models are ubiquitous. They could be used for understanding any phenomena. So I think having a strong background in mathematics is very critical, and I think engineering is the field where you need to impart that in knowledge. So mathematical models have to be part of the program. You would say, why can't mathematicians do that? Mathematicians very rarely work on the applied side. They are good at developing theory of mathematics, but not very comfortable in solving or applying it to the practical. That's where engineering comes. By definition, engineering profession is application of the basic sciences to solve problems. And that's where having a good understanding of mathematics, you are now applying that to solve the problems. So it needs to be enhanced in the engineering programs. Proper validation is very important of the mathematical models, because if you are using this as a management tool and you do not do the validation, the one thing about mathematical model is if you run the model, it will give you the output. How good that output is would depend on how properly it has been validated and how correctly it is formulated and correct parameters are being used. So that's why validation becomes very important. And holistic research programs should define the parameters needed for mathematical models, and well-planned experiment must be done to determine these parameters. And when I say holistic research program, that's where I'm referring is like there's one lab cannot develop thermal properties or physical properties of all grain types. So maybe we need to create a coordinated program and say this lab focus on beans, this lab focus on this, and you develop the database of the physical parameters. Similarly, we need to involve entomologists who are working on different insect species, because India has different insects infesting grain, Canada has different insects. So we need to coordinate and develop a coordinated similar experiment all over the labs, so that you create a comprehensive database. And then you can run the model to manage the grain around the globe. Next, I think that's the last one. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the valuable insights. The dais is now open for the questions.